yeah, I can just blame a lack of usability testing already. This is great and really in keeping with my theme. But yeah, no, so thank you very much. And it's really great being here. And yes, I'm sorry it's going to be that talk at what's meant to be a proper coding conference, so apologies. But yeah, so welcome to Dude, Do You Even Design? Okay, so yeah, as Christiana said, I'm a user experience designer. I work at the Natural History Museum within the digital media and marketing department. And actually, it's a really cool and really exciting time because partly because the department is quite new, but also owing to like some of the major issues that we're facing when it comes to, say, environment and managing climate change, and also the increased relevance of information-driven decision-making and how we can better empower citizenry to make sensible decisions. It's a really interesting time because we're really starting to grapple with the harder questions of what actually can we in sort of natural history, within the museum sector, what can we in the digital area actually do to help better communicate science, data, science history to the general public. And one of the main how might we questions that we like to ask ourselves is really around how do we encourage an engagement with nature. And this is, although on the surface, a fairly simple question, what I really love about it is that as we ask ourselves this, it really forces us to think about the full context of our guests, of our users, right? Because so thinking about how we can encourage people to engage with nature, we have to think about the fact that people exist in this really complex, ever-dynamic system. And so as we're talking about engagement, we have to think about, obviously, hardware. What kind of devices do they have? What devices are they using? And especially considering we're a global institution. So we're not just talking about what are the latest gadgets that people have access to in the West, but also what, say, does your impoverished PhD student in Chile have? And how can we create systems that they can use to get the information that they need to do their research? And that also kind of neatly ties in with questions about linguistic affinity, right? Because not only are we trying to design for languages that are very different, say, from like the Latin alphabets, but also even if we look at, say, the British context, and even if you narrow in more to the Natural History Museum itself, like Kensington is massively diverse. Like South Kensington is famously actually very French. There's a well-established and well-naturalized French community there. But then North Kensington, which again is almost like a completely different context to South Kensington, you see a massive amount of diversity, a high recently arrived population, recent refugees and asylum seekers. And so questions about like how we can transmit science in a way that crosses hardware, linguistic affinity, obviously takes into account the digital divide, which is still a very real thing within the UK. And then we have all these other really practical considerations that actually, when we're seriously trying to think about how we solve this question, we're forced to engage with. And I personally love it. I really love these hard, knotty questions. It's one of the reasons why I even got into user experience design. It's one of the reasons why I'm really interested in complex system science, for example. And the thing I really love about it is that in a way you have these two parallel streams. Because on the one hand, you're asking yourself, okay, how do we solve these immediate needs that people have? And these are often the needs that people can articulate first and foremost. But then also, how do we do this whilst still sort of laying the groundwork for solving the bigger underlying problems? And perhaps unsurprisingly, as a service designer, I don't think it's impossible to do both. So kind of to give you some more context to my way of working, my approach to user experience is taken very much from the precedent set by service design. And service design is kind of a more holistic way of thinking about any kind of product that you create. You're not just thinking about the sort of the physical artifact or the printed artifact or whatever that when it's used or when it's in the user's hands, but you're really thinking about the wider context, how they came to it, how they bought it, how they're supported when something goes wrong. And so the official definition of service design is, really long and boring. The activity of planning and organizing people, infrastructure, communication, and material components of a service in order to improve its quality and the interaction between service provider and customers. It goes on. But basically, there's like 5 main principles behind service design. So obviously, it has to be user-centered. So you're really putting the user and the person at the center of the actual product. So it's deeply humanist in that regard. It's also co-creative, so a really important aspect is the sense of continually involving other people, especially those who are either going to be part of the service in the sense of actually either providing the support, whether that's for, maybe it could be the database, maybe it could be help support, but also as well as those who will actually be using the service. Another key principle is this idea of sequencing, and the fact that actually it should be really obvious, but it's specifically mentioned because of the fact that often when we create products, we tend to kind of get really swayed by the nice, bright, shiny idea, and we forget the fact that it's best to kind of break it down logically in terms of what actually are the steps, not just in terms of, say, how the API works, but also how people, say, even come to the interface in the first place. Evidencing. Now, this is particularly interesting, especially as we're having more conversations about data and privacy, because the evidencing principle is all about making sure that customers, as they are using your service, are actually aware of all the various elements of the service that they're encountering. And that's kind of a frightening thought when you think about how many of the digital services that we currently use, which actually fail completely in that regard. Sometimes for very good reason, but again, that's probably something we could explore a bit further. And the 5th principle is that of being completely holistic, really taking into account the entire experience of a service. And from this, the really important thing to remember is the context. Context matters. And so what really initially kind of got me more into the service design aspect of user experience design, funnily enough, was actually my initial experience as a user experience designer at National Grid, because it was there working for a large utilities firm where you really had to understand, say, even a very simple mobile app, not just in terms of the engineers who are directly using it, but in terms of their supervisors, in terms of the general public who they were interacting with. There were already at that level so many sort of legal niceties as well as IT and engineering processes that you really had to take into account. And so from that experience, I kind of learned the fact that, and it seems really obvious, but it kind of has to be said, that technology, all technologies are a service. I think sometimes we get kind of trapped by our own jargon, like we're so used to, SaaS and PaaS and all that kind of stuff. And actually, fundamentally, any technology, anything that humans interact with to extend their reach is ultimately a service and should be treated as such. And that's important when we think about the entire holistic context in which that product sits. And I think it's particularly important to remember this because the reality is that sometimes it seems a really obvious thing that isn't always perhaps learned when it comes to our interesting little sector where we're kind of creating all these really fun and funky new tools. Because even though we may naturally think it's really obvious that yes, technology is a service, the fact is it doesn't really seem to impact much of how we actually operate or the way we distribute our technologies or the way we actually treat our customers. Now, I'm slightly obsessed with these guys. So this is Charles and Ray Eames, who are these amazing product designers, really avant-garde and really fascinating, deeply humanist design. And they had this analogy of the designed object and the user. It's kind of like this guest-host relationship. And I find that really fascinating and actually also quite terrifying, because if I use that to analyze so much of the technology that I use on a day-to-day basis, I realize that actually, quite frankly, yeah, they're a piss-poor host. Sorry, Google, but really, that's the truth of it. And there's so many really kind of really obvious examples. So the other day I had a friend who was telling me that they were trying to sign up for a Vimeo account, and apparently, it was important that they had to state their gender, and when it did, they were given the options of male, female, and neutral, because of course, there are so many gender-neutral people going around. I mean, you can't help but think, okay, whoever came up with this form, yes, I think they definitely need a case of sort of gender studies 101. And then even when you think about things, say, so from some of the latest data, certainly that we have at the Natural History Museum, at least 20% of our audience, for example, are people who are living with physical disabilities, right? And have various access issues. And that's at least 20%, because actually there's also temporary ability issues, and also this is self-reported. So a lot of people might not think of themselves as having or needing additional assistance when it comes to accessibility. But if we think about, say, this baseline, this bare minimum of 20%, and if we look around us, not just at our physical infrastructures in the cities, but also our digital infrastructures, I don't know, like, have you ever tried using your email client as though you couldn't use your hands? Have you ever tried to imagine what it would be like to actually simply try to send an email using, say, an eye scanner or eye tracker or some similar technology? It's really fascinating when we use this metaphor of the guest and host relationship to actually analyze the stuff that we kind of take for granted, and we realize that actually we're being treated appallingly by people who are meant, by systems and by companies that are meant to be our hosts. I think the really famous example, even though it was a couple of years ago, but I use it in particular because it kind of brings up so many interesting issues. It's like the very first, or one of the early incarnations of the Google facial recognition software, where this guy, Jackie Alcine, when he found that actually, say, the recognition software had actually categorized all the photos of himself with his black friends in as gorillas, right? And actually I found, and there's so many interesting aspects to this. I mean, obviously there's the issue around, okay, who actually did you do your testing with? Now, probably the obvious answer is, well, with whoever was in the office, and that says a lot about, well, the state of diversity in your office. It also says a lot about, say, our attitudes to technology. I found it really fascinating. There was an interview with a specialist in machine learning called Yoshua Benji, and he was talking about how this is, it's baby steps, it's going to make these mistakes. But then when they asked, well, did it ever confuse any white people with monkeys, there was absolute silence, because of course it didn't. And this is because this isn't actually a matter simply of baby steps. This is a matter of people who are designing a particular service and are not realizing the fact that as a service, it's going out into the big, wider world. And they're not really fully appreciating what it means to be a user and a client of a particular service, of the range of clients. And so that's something that, as we're quite early in the talk, so just before you do go into your sleep-induced coma, I'd like to make it absolutely clear and be brutally honest as possible. For those of you who are designers or developers or entrepreneurs, or you have some amazing new tech idea, you may not imagine that, say, a black trans woman will be using your service. But just imagine, one of your personas may well have a black trans woman who's a friend. So imagine how she might be impacted by that service that you have created. So at that point, you are now more or less free to go into your lunch-induced coma. And I shall continue. This is kind of fun for me. So yes, there's like so many other examples of this breakdown of this relationship. And fundamentally, what we're seeing is that evidence of technology not actually being appreciated as a service within a human context, which is why we have to keep reminding ourselves of this really obvious fact that all technology is a service. And what's more, not only does this show that technology isn't really being fully appreciated within the social and human context, it's actually just bad design. Like, it doesn't matter how innovative it is, it doesn't matter how shiny it is. I'm sorry, crap like this, quite frankly, just leads one to answer, like, dude, do you even design? No, seriously. I mean, you could literally just do so much better. It's not that hard, Too often, I also think part of the problem is that when we talk about design, we tend to use it to refer to, say, graphic design or making things look pretty, when fundamentally design is actually about solving problems. And that applies as much to graphic design as well as the things that are meant to just look pretty. That is still ultimately solving a problem. And at this point, I will say, because I'm sure most of us here are probably developers, if you encounter a designer, you have my permission to keep asking them what problem they think they're solving. It is okay, and in fact, it is your duty to keep challenging your resident user experience or UI designer whenever they go off into their lovely little, clouds up in the skies, daydreaming about flat interfaces. seriously, do, like, call them out on it. Ask them, what actual problem is this solving, okay? This shouldn't be about their lovely little portfolio that they can use to hopefully get a job at Uber or whatever. This should be about solving a particular problem that a user has. So do not be afraid to call them out on it. And if they start talking, honestly, literally, just pin them down, and you can, okay? Because you are the guys who are actually making these services, so do. And if they get really tetchy about it, just send them to my Twitter account, and then I'll have a word with them. But yeah, so fundamentally, if we have to keep reminding ourselves that design isn't about simply making things pretty or the aesthetics, forgetting the fact that even that aspect is actually fundamentally about solving a problem. And so I'm saying that kind of just to reassure you, because I know obviously you have this user experience designer coming up here and talking. But when I'm talking about a designer, I'm not obviously just talking about, say, a graphic designer. If you're a solution architect, if you're a front-end engineer, big data analyst, back-end engineer, if you are basically making something that is there to solve a problem, you are still a designer. That is how I'm using that term right now. And yes, again, just to reiterate, I also hope that will give you the confidence in future to challenge your resident-friendly UX designer. That's totally fine. Oh, okay. Oh, cool. Thank you. Okay. So I get really inflamed and passionate about this stuff. So, yeah, you have to bear with me sometimes when that happens. Okay, so back to service design, for those of you who are still awake. Ultimately, context is key. And by context, what I mean is really having to understand the way people behave and the way people act and the things that are impacting them and their daily structures, right? So this is basically ethnography. And again, to be honest, this isn't something that is just the realm of the user experience designer. However, I also want to be clear that I'm not saying that this is something that everyone has to go out and do. What I am really trying to say is, like, if you've identified the fact that your resident designer is so keen on making sure everything looks like lovely and flat and has like 1 pixel diameter and all kinds of nonsense, if they're not doing this work, again, call them out on it, because that context is key to understanding how any piece of technology will fit in the lives of their users, because that's what you want to understand. You want to understand how whatever service you're creating will actually fit into their lives. And so that's another thing as well, personas. So I'm sure you'll find a lot of those. Admittedly, they're great when it comes to tapping into the specific needs and requirements of a target audience. But often, actually, what we end up doing is then focusing in quite a narrow way on their function, perhaps, if then. Really, from a service design perspective, it's important to research the non-personas, because after all, your personas are part of networks. They're not simply static individuals. So my grandmother doesn't use Facebook. However, she's still impacted by the fact that some of the photos of her are on Facebook because we, her grandchildren, use Facebook. So it's okay to think holistically. Research the non-personas. That's just as important as researching and understanding your personas. And don't be afraid to get uncomfortable. And again, this is a point where I'm going to be really blunt and brutally honest, because I think we've seen so many examples of how really exciting and unique and innovative and potentially innovative technology often fails the most vulnerable. Again, I'm just going to be really blunt. So if, say, your wonderful resident user experience designer has come up with this wonderful persona who's like a woman, don't be afraid to ask them more challenging questions like, okay, fine, so how does she deal with stalkers? How does she deal with street harassment? How does she deal with the fact that she has an on average lower amount of disposable income? Is she trans? Is she a person of color? Does she have any access issues? Like, these are the things that it may well seem that your resident designer gets frustrated about the fact that you're asking these harder questions, but seriously, don't be afraid to. And actually, to be honest, it's their job to do that. This is not to say that you have to go out and do that research, although it would be really great that if you could at least contribute, not least really just to show them up, because this data and this research is out there. But yeah, keep them under your finger and make sure that they are considering the fullness of what it means for that person to exist as a human being within a human society. And this is the point where I always go into real talk. as well. So yeah, if you thought I was blunt before, I mean, to be honest, this is really just me recounting statistics, because I think it's important as well when we're talking about services. Really, that's as much about being like brutally honest with ourselves about the context that we're in, right? So if we take this country, for example, you're in a country where there's, at least 2,000 known food banks, and they're feeding like millions of people each year. We're in a country where there's still actually quite a significant digital divide. In the West Midlands alone, you've got up to 20% of people meeting low and non-use criteria, right? Birmingham alone has like the 4th highest rate of homelessness in the UK. And suddenly when you're kind of surrounded by these, like when you really take the time to take a step back and really seriously, honestly think about the place that your technology has in this society, I think at the very least it will help. I think it does genuinely help you think about how really are these services, how really is this database, how really is this API going to fit within this social context? And that's a great question and I do think that's a very valuable question to ask, not least because, and I can say this from experience, you often end up just making better tech, quite frankly. Adam St. John Lawrence is this really amazing service designer, and he often talks about how ideas shouldn't just come from your head, but from people, and they should be based on real, organic needs. And I think that's really important for us in tech to remember, because too often I kind of feel like we're so busy searching for nails to batter with our shiny new frameworks that we kind of miss the right nails, so to speak. So all this talk about kind of getting to know people, I mean, yeah, that's often kind of known as like the empathy stage of like the design process. But again, I don't think it's something that you should like restrict yourself to thinking of like, okay, right, we've now empathized, now we can ideate, and then we can create. Like this is something that you have to continually be doing, not least because you're in an ever-changing, complex and dynamic environment. So it is always important that you are continually challenging what it is that you think you've learned, right? And yes, to be honest, as you can probably tell, we're not really so much talking about empathy. We're really kind of getting into advocacy, actually, because it's a must if we're going to design technology in a much more holistic way to avoid repeating failings where Black people are identified as gorillas, okay? So as an exercise, I always like to say to people, imagine your product, if it helps, in the hands of someone who is your absolute opposite in every single way. As I said before, sometimes we just have to be really blunt about the situation and about what we need to do. And ideally, if you can, and particularly if you're based in a massive, very multicultural city, so if you're based near, say, Birmingham or Coventry or London or Manchester or Edinburgh, actually, to be honest, you have no excuse, because you can very easily find people who are literally as different from you as possible, and actually get them to interact with your technology, get them to test it, get into this mindset of, do you know what, fine, we have created this functionality, we have completed this user story, now let's actually see what happens. Let's see what happens when it's put in the hands of the persona, but also in the hands of someone who is completely opposite, and get their feedback, and actually really take it as an opportunity to get to know their context. And again, if you're not comfortable doing that, and your user experience designer is not doing that, send them over to me and I will properly sort them out, because that is what they're paid to do, quite frankly. So yeah, this is very, very important. Technology is not in a bubble. There's no T=0. It's not like you release your product and suddenly like the whole universe comes into being once more. Your service will actually end up interacting not only creating new social dynamics, but already existing social dynamics. And so in that sense, it will both impact and be impacted by its environment. I think also, and so this perhaps is more applicable to anyone who wants to be a product designer or project manager. I think actually to truly, if you really do appreciate the complexity of the context in which your technology sits in, then actually I think it probably means restructuring how you fund your projects. So at the very least, you should have a large enough pot of money so that by the time when you've released a product and when you've kind of done all like those itty-bitty bug fixes that you always have to do, actually almost do like a mini research project. See actually how your product is being used in the context that you thought it was being used, that you thought it would ideally be suited for, and find out if that's the case. Because again, that is how you fully understand whether your service is operating as it should. And quite frankly, it means that you get to learn quicker and most importantly, to avoid the kind of embarrassing and horrifying mistakes that can often be made. So lastly, as I've just been talking about complex systems, I fully understand, and obviously as a user experience designer myself, designing for complex systems is hard because you're always going to miss something. There's always going to be something that you can't predict. Fine, I'm saying talk to people who are not just your personas, but the obvious answer to that is, well, where does that end? I can literally go around. Does that mean I have to talk to all 60 million people or so in the UK? Like, what does that actually mean? So on that note, I will also say, well, here's another challenge for you. Why not open up? So in this particular city, in Birmingham, this is a city with some of the best universities in the world. And I challenge you, especially for those of you who are product designers or entrepreneurs, hire your back-end dev, hire your UI designer, hire your front-end dev, but maybe try hiring a sociologist. Maybe try hiring a historian of technology. There's plenty of them around. And in a city like Birmingham, which was one of the first industrialized cities in the world, you have at least 300 years worth of data to analyze for how technology can impact societies and social groups. You're sitting on a gold mine. I know it's really fashionable as well. There's folks like this company called Vidyard over in the States, and they love to talk about how much they hire folks from the humanities. And I understand that there's folks acting like chief philosophy officers in Silicon Valley. But yeah, I would say just start with the folks who are here. Start with maybe some of the troublemakers. And actually, especially when we're talking about how to design systems or services for really complex environments, these people, these sociologists, these feminist theorists, these queer theorists, actually they're very used to analyzing and understanding quantitative data in a practical way, because a lot of them actually are hoping to use that data and their research ultimately to get funding to solve particular issues that particular communities face. So seriously, hire the sociologist, hire the historian of technology and history, and actually you'll probably find that they all can do that work for you that maybe your flat UI obsessed UX designer isn't doing. I think I just want to end on the fact that I might sound like, okay, I'm really critical about technology, and it's true. I do think there's still a lot of harmful narratives in technology. I think there's lots of issues around, say, the lone genius, the visionary entrepreneur mythology, kind of like the objectivity of the enlightenment of maths and code. And yes, I do think there are some negative aspects that definitely infect our tech. They infect our ways of working. But to be honest, the only way out of that is solidarity. It's by listening to people and watching them and engaging with them. You don't have to talk to them, because sometimes that can be really cringy and embarrassing, but just listen to them. You'll hear some fascinating conversations at Birmingham New Street, and a number of them are all revolved around the technology that they use on a daily basis. Solve their actual problems, not just the dream problems. As a child, I loved science fiction, and I loved imagining the future world where nobody would be hungry, we'd be all traveling by cars that went up in the sky. And honestly, I think there is a good chance that we could probably still get there. We could probably still get to this world if we just listened to each other and talked with each other, and most importantly, advocated for each other, particularly us who are working in technology. And then actually, if we just do these very simple things, I think maybe we could kind of end up in this really cool Afrofuturist world that I've been dreaming of since I was like a kid. So yeah, let's do this. Thank you. Cool, so I do have some time for questions. It's all good.
So what's some examples, or an example anyway, of this sort of thing done well?
Do you know, actually, that's a really good point. I think sometimes that is the truth. It's a thing that's often said. Something that's well designed, it's harder to tell when something's well designed because it's well designed. It works the way it should, and you don't notice the fact that it works well. So I personally, because the more negative aspects of technology tend to be more in terms of social platforms, and those are kind of the places that aren't so great. So, I mean, I quite like Mastodon, for example, as like an alternative to Twitter. Like, it does have some issues of its own, to be sure, but I quite like that ownership that encourages amongst its users and the responsiveness to, say, issues around abuse, which, say, Twitter still has massive problems with, to be honest. Again, a lot of this stuff is probably, so like there's the alternative to Airbnb, which is like predominantly for, well, it's marketed at Black and people of color, but what's really great is because they learned the lessons from Airbnb, and so they've made sure that it's not just about sticking up for, say, Black people who want to travel, it's also like for queer Black people who want to travel. So they've kind of learned those lessons and really thought, so it tends to be quite bad. So if you have someone who is essentially a racist, and yeah, because nobody says, oh, I'm a racist, by the way. It's only often when a Black person goes to the house, or like the Black person would have paid, or like it's not, maybe say they don't use their avatar or their photograph, for example, and then say the renter, the person kind of renting out their space finds out it's a Black person. And basically Airbnb is really terrible at dealing with that. Probably for similar reasons to Twitter. I mean, again, I think it's also very important that I'm not trying to say that, oh, Airbnb, Google, and Twitter are all super, super massively racist. It's that kind of, I mean, they are in the terms of like a sociologist perspective. I'm aware I have to be careful, but there.
Design issues or like management stuff, like all the way Twitter deals with the
So from a service design perspective, that's still a design issue, because if you're creating a platform that people are using, you should be considering, well, what happens when they have any problem? Even say if the server goes down, what happens? And that is something that's part of the. Mm? Do you know? No. But that's the point. So that means it's not there. And I think that's the thing from a service design perspective. It's not enough to say, oh, well, we have a button that means that you can press that, like Facebook, you can tell me if that's abusive. No, the point is, well, what happens next? How does the person who abused me get dealt with? Design goes much beyond that. Totally. Yeah. Mm. Hello.
So I was quite interested by the term you used a few as Afrofutures.
Yes.
I'm just not sound dumb, but I don't know what that means, and I'd like you to elaborate on that.
Cool. No problem. So Afrofuturism, it's, I suppose, at a very simplistic way, it can be imagined as speculative imagining that includes people of color and deliberately includes people of color. Yes, that's a nice way of summing it up. Cool. Yes.
Do you have any sort of reading list suggestions for technologists who may want to start diving deeper into social issues that don't immediately impact them?
Yes, actually. So definitely check out some of the people like Media Diversified, the Galdem Collective. There's the open, it's called HAU for short, HAU, and they're like an open ethnography research group. They publish a journal that you can, again, easily access. There's also, it's called, if you use the hashtag it's 11Y, that's a really good, I suppose, resource as well for accessibility issues when it comes to technology. Yeah, so, oh gosh. Yeah, but yeah, there's actually quite a lot, but definitely the open journal of ethnography is great. Again, because if your UX designer goes, oh, this is too much work, you can say, well, here is all the methodology that you could use that won't take that long. So yeah, cool. Awesome, and thank you very much.